The man at the counter squinted through a haze of dust and whiskey breath. "You sure you want that parcel?" he asked, tapping the brittle map with a stained finger. Jack McCrae said nothing at first. He just looked down at the red-inked square that marked a forgotten patch of land west of the Gila River. To anyone else, it was nothing but dry earth and broken sagebrush. To him, it was the first quiet place he'd found in 10 years. $50, the clerk said, half laughing. "That's all it's worth." "Ain't much but dirt and bones." Jack peeled a few wrinkled bills from his coat. "50's all I've got." The clerk hesitated, glancing toward the window where the sun baked the street outside. "There's talk about that valley," he said. "Used to be Apache ground. Some say it still is." Jack met his gaze, steady, dry-eyed. "I'm not buying ghosts, just land." The man shrugged, reached for his ledger, and wrote the name Jack McCrae in looping script. He stamped the paper hard enough to leave a red scar on it. "Congratulations," he muttered. "You just bought yourself a curse." The ride south took 3 days. Jack crossed canyons cut by wind and time, following a trail of yucca and broken fence posts that led him into the valley. The world grew quieter with each mile, the kind of silence that made a man listen to his own heartbeat. By the time he reached the ranch, the sky had turned the color of tarnished copper. The gate hung open, one hinge missing. A single raven perched on the post, croaking once before taking flight. Jack dismounted, boots sinking into the dust. The house ahead was nothing but a shell. 2 rooms, a leaning porch, roof patched with tin. The wind pushed through the boards like a whisper through teeth. He tied his horse to the rail and stepped inside. The air smelled of soot and age. A cradle of cobwebs hung in one corner. On the table lay a broken pipe, a coffee tin, and a faded photograph of a woman holding a child. He turned it over. The back read only Dry Creek, 1877. He set it down gently. Outside, the sun slipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows over the yard. Jack walked to the well, dropped a stone, and waited. It hit bottom after 5 long seconds. Water still there. He smiled faintly. It was a start. He spent the next hour clearing out the stable. His horse, an old sorrel named Jude, nickered low as the wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the mesquite, coyotes started their evening chorus. Jack froze. Between the howls, he heard something else, a dull thump like footsteps moving slow across hard ground. He stepped out, hand resting on the worn grip of his revolver. Nothing, just the plain stretching empty. Still, the hairs on his neck stood. He'd felt this kind of quiet before ambushes, before gunfire. He shook it off. "For your jumping at shadows, old man," he muttered. That night, Jack lit a small fire in the hearth and cooked beans straight from the can. He sat on the floorboards, the deed beside him, the flames painting gold across his tired face. He thought about the $50 he'd paid, about the clerk's warning, about the word curse. He'd seen real curses, men drunk on gold, towns burning for nothing. Land couldn't hate a man, could it? A gust slipped through the cracks and rattled the tin roof. The flames bent sideways, guttered, then steadied again. For a heartbeat, Jack thought he heard something carried in that wind. A low chant, soft and rhythmic, words he didn't know. He reached for his hat, stood and stepped to the door. Moonlight washed the valley silver. The sage trembled in waves. Far out near the ridge, a small cluster of stones glimmered pale against the dark, arranged in a perfect circle. He hadn't seen them before. He closed the door slowly. "Sacred ground," he whispered to himself. The phrase sat heavy in his chest. He'd fought Apaches once, years ago. The army had called it duty. He called it something else now. He poured himself a sip of whiskey, stared into the fire and let the memory crawl up from wherever he'd buried it. Smoke rising from burned camps, a boy's cry cut short, the stink of scorched mesquite. He pressed a hand to his eyes. $50, he murmured. That's what peace costs. Outside, the wind shifted again, warmer this time, almost like a sigh. The fire cracked once, sparks jumping up the chimney. Jack didn't notice the small mark appearing on the deed beside him. A faint smudge of ash, shaped like a handprint, black against the paper's edge. He leaned back against the wall, eyelids heavy, the land whispering beyond the door. Morning came slow, creeping through cracks in the walls until the light found Jack McCrae's face. He woke with his hat tipped over his eyes, revolver still within reach. and the faint memory of that whisper clinging to the air like smoke. Outside, the valley stretched wide and empty. Dew clung to the brittle grass. The well rope creaked in the breeze. It might have been a picture of peace if not for the stillness, that uneasy kind of quiet that made the world feel like it was waiting for something. Jack saddled Jude and rode the fence line. What had once been 100 acres of promise now lay in ruin. Broken posts, collapsed corrals, tumbleweed gathered like graves. Coyotes scattered at his approach. Their prints crossed over deeper ones, boot marks, not animal tracks, fresh. He reined in, studying them. 3 men, maybe, heavy-footed, heading toward the north ridge. He followed a short distance until the ground grew rocky. Then the tracks vanished between stones. Whoever they were, they knew the land better than he did. He turned Jude back toward the ranch. From the hilltop, the valley looked almost peaceful again. He tried to picture what it might have been. The house standing proud, cattle spread along the creek, a woman on the porch waiting at dusk. But that was just fancy. Dreams didn't last long in a place like this. By noon, the heat rose heavy. Jack stripped his coat, rolled up his sleeves and started mending the corral. It was mindless work, the kind that dulled the noise inside a man's head. He hammered until sweat streaked the dust on his arms, until he could almost forget the sound of that chant in the wind. Then, as he paused for water, he noticed something at the far edge of the yard, a small pile of stones stacked with purpose. He walked closer, crouched, brushed the dust away. Beneath the top rock lay a carved symbol, 2 crossing lines and a sunburst shape burned into the stone. Apache. He knew enough of their signs to understand one word: warning. Jack straightened, scanning the ridge. The land lay empty, but the hairs on his arms rose again. He felt watched, not by eyes of the living, but by the weight of memory pressed deep into the soil. He went back to the house and found his canteen near the door. Next to it lay something that hadn't been there before, a feather black and white bound with red thread. It was set carefully on the step like an offering, or a message. "All right," he muttered, glancing toward the horizon. "If someone's out there, you got my attention." He set the feather on the table beside the deed. The faint handprint from the night before still stained the corner. When he tried to rub it away, it smeared darker instead. He didn't sleep that night. The second day came hotter, wind carrying the smell of rain from far-off mountains. Jack rode north to find water along the creek bed. What he found instead was silence, and something else. At the mouth of a shallow canyon, he came upon a circle of ash. Blackened timbers jutted from the ground, remains of an old camp, burned years ago, maybe longer. But among the ashes lay things that time hadn't claimed: pottery shards, arrowheads, beads made of turquoise. He dismounted, crouched low, touched the earth. It was soft, darker than the soil around it. A burial ground. He looked up the canyon walls where faint markings still lingered, handprints, faded red ochre. A people had lived here, prayed here, died here, and now he'd bought it for $50 and a promise of solitude. Jack took off his hat, holding it to his chest. "Didn't know," he whispered. "Didn't know." A sound broke the stillness, movement from above. He snapped his head up, hand on his revolver. On the ridge, a figure stood against the sky, tall, wrapped in buckskin, face hidden by shadow. Jack froze. The figure didn't move, didn't raise a weapon, didn't flee, just watched. Then, as quick as the wind shifted, it was gone. He waited, heart hammering, eyes searching the ridge. Nothing. Only the rustle of mesquite leaves in the breeze. He let out a slow breath, holstered his gun, and mounted Jude again. The ride back felt longer, heavier. The world seemed to lean in around him, whispering in a language he didn't understand. When he reached the ranch, he found the front door open. He'd left it closed that morning. Inside, everything was where he'd left it, except for the deed. It lay in the center of the table, unfolded, the handprint now darker. And beside it, written in charcoal across the margin, 4 words in uneven script: "The ground remembers blood." Jack stared at it until the fire inside him, the same old fire he'd carried from war to war, started to rise again. "All right then," he said quietly. "If the land remembers, so do I." He folded the paper, tucked it into his coat, and stepped out into the dying light. Above the ridge, thunder rolled like drums. By the 3rd morning, the wind had changed. It carried the dry taste of iron and something else, the faint smell of smoke that didn't belong to his fire. Jack McCrae stood at the edge of his porch, boots sinking into powdery earth, scanning the horizon. Nothing but open sky and sagebrush. But the valley felt different now. It was no longer silent. It was listening. He'd thought about leaving the night before, saddling up and riding until the mountains swallowed him whole. But $50 was still $50, and pride was heavier than any pack. He wasn't about to be chased off by whispers and handprints. By sunrise, he was following the creek bed again. The land had a way of showing its secrets to those who looked long enough. Hoof prints near the water, light and sharp unlike any of his own horses. And beside them, smaller tracks, bare feet moving in careful patterns circling his property. He crouched, running a finger along the edge of one print. Child-sized, maybe. The heel pressed deeper than the toes, like whoever made it carried something heavy. He followed the trail north until it led into a narrow draw between two ridges. The wind died there, muffled by red stone walls that held the day's heat. He led Jude on foot, the horse's breath loud in the still air. The prints ended near a cluster of boulders. Jack scanned the ground, disturbed dust, faint ashes, and scraps of woven cloth tucked beneath a rock. He lifted it and found a small pouch made of hide tied shut with sinew. Inside were 3 turquoise beads, a bundle of dried sage, and a single human tooth. He closed it fast, swallowing the dryness in his throat. There were stories men used to tell around campfires, about Apache warriors marking sacred ground, about offerings to the spirits of those lost in raids. Jack had laughed at such things once. Now, standing in that hollow place where the air itself seemed to hum, he wasn't laughing. He tied the pouch back the way he found it, whispering without thinking. Didn't mean to trespass. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. On the canyon wall, half hidden by shadow, was a carving, a circle with jagged rays like the sun. Beneath it, a single handprint, pressed deep into the rock and stained the color of rust. But this wasn't old paint. It was fresh. Jack stepped back, heart thudding. The mark glistened faintly in the light. Whoever left it was close, watching. He gripped his Colt and backed toward Jude, scanning the ridges. A movement, quick, just beyond the rocks. Then silence, the kind that crawls down your neck. Show yourself. His voice cracked the air. Only the echo answered him. Then faintly from somewhere above came a single sound, like a child's cry, sharp and sudden, swallowed just as quickly by the wind. Jack froze. Hello? No answer. He mounted fast, spurred Jude hard, and rode until the canyon widened and the world returned to color again. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The sound still echoed in his head. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was falling low, turning the land to copper. The well rope creaked again, steady as a heartbeat. Jack poured a drink from his canteen and sat on the porch, staring out across the valley. That's when he saw it, just at the edge of the fence line. A figure, small, unmoving. He rose slowly, hand near his gun, and stepped down the porch. It was a boy, maybe 10, barefoot, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better years. His face was dirt-streaked, eyes dark as the canyon itself. He stood still, unflinching even as Jack approached. "Hey there," Jack said softly. "You lost?" The boy didn't answer. His gaze flicked toward the mountains, then back to Jack. In his hand, he held a stick with feathers tied to it, the same black and white pattern as the one Jack had found on his doorstep. "You leave this for me?" Jack asked. The boy said something in Apache, low, quiet, the syllables smooth as river stones. Jack didn't understand, but he caught one word repeated twice: ground. Before he could speak again, the boy turned and bolted toward the ridge, quick as a shadow. Jack shouted, started to chase, but stopped. The desert has its own laws, and maybe this was one of them. He stood there until the last trace of the boy disappeared into the hills. Then he looked down at his boots. The dust around them was marked by 2 sets of footprints, his own and the child's, and between them, faint but clear, another print half buried in the dirt. A barefoot adult, watching them both. That night Jack didn't light a lamp. He sat at the table with the deed laid open in front of him, the black handprint almost pulsing in the dimness. He thought about the boy's eyes, the cry in the canyon, the blood-colored mark on the rock. He whispered to no one. $50 don't seem so cheap now. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer this time, like the land was waking. The rain came before dawn, soft at first, then heavy enough to shake the dust from the rafters. Jack McCrae had been awake long before the light broke, listening to it hammer against the roof like 1,000 whispered voices. He couldn't shake the image of the boy standing in the dust, silent, unafraid, and watching. When the storm eased, he stepped outside. The valley smelled of wet sage and iron, and thin ribbons of water ran down the slopes, carving small channels into the earth. The world felt washed clean but not empty. The wind carried that same quiet hum that had haunted him since the day he'd arrived, the sound of something ancient breathing just beneath the ground. Jack saddled Jude and rode toward the ridge, where he had last seen the boy. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of rain, and every hoofstep splashed softly in the shallow mud. He moved slowly, scanning the ridges for any sign of movement. About halfway up the trail, he caught sight of smoke rising faintly from a hollow among the rocks. Dismounting, he tied Jude to a mesquite and approached on foot, revolver drawn. The hollow opened into a small cave framed by brush and stone. Inside, a small fire burned, and beside it sat an old woman wrapped in a woven blanket, her grey hair braided and bound with feathers. She did not flinch when she saw him. "I mean no harm," Jack said, lowering his gun. The woman nodded slowly and motioned for him to sit. He hesitated, then obeyed, feeling the warmth of the fire on his hands. "Are you come for the boy?" she said, her voice soft but certain. Jack's brow furrowed. "You know him?" he asked. "He is not mine," she replied. "But the land watches him, same as it watches you." Jack looked around and noticed faint drawings on the cave walls, circles, figures, animals, handprints, stories etched in red and black. "What is this place?" he asked. She poked at the fire with a stick before answering. "Before your people came, this valley had another name. We called it Senadashi, the place where stones speak." Jack said nothing, only listened. The woman's eyes stayed on the flames as she continued. "My people buried their dead here, men, women, children. Then the soldiers came, said the land was theirs. They took it, burned the homes, shot the ones who stayed. You built fences over bones." Her words hung heavy in the damp air, and Jack stared into the fire, his chest tightening. He had seen enough death in his life to fill 10 graves. He'd told himself he came here to start over, to find quiet. But maybe there was no quiet left for men like him. "I didn't know," he said quietly. The woman gave a faint, knowing smile. "Now you do." The fire popped and rain hissed at the cave mouth. "The boy," Jack asked after a moment, "why was he near my land?" The woman's gaze was steady. "He was born of those who remember. He keeps the old ways. When men like you dig up the earth and call it property, he listens for the voices that rise." Jack frowned. "Voices?" She looked past him into the storm. "This ground still breathes, Dadili. You feel it, don't you?" Jack swallowed hard. "I've felt something." The woman shook her head gently. "It's not ghosts. It's memory. The earth remembers what men forget." Silence filled the cave. The wind moaned through the canyon, carrying a low note like a mourning song. Then the woman reached into her blanket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She held it out to him, and Jack took it carefully. A small leather pouch tied with sinew, the same kind he had found by the rocks. "Keep this," she said. "It's for protection, not from the dead but from the living." Jack turned it over in his hand. "Who's out there?" he asked. Her eyes sharpened. "It's men who see what you bought. They want it. They do not care what sleeps beneath it." He thought of the boot prints by his porch, the night his door had been left open. "Then I'll handle them," he said. "You cannot fight the land, Cowboy," she said softly. "You can only listen." Jack stood and tucked the pouch into his coat. "I'll try." The woman's eyes followed him as he turned toward the rain. "The boy will find you again," she said. "When the wind changes." He paused at the mouth of the cave. "What should I call you?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Names don't matter out here. The land knows mine." Jack nodded once and stepped into the grey light. By the time he returned to the ranch, the rain had thinned to mist, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. He hung his hat by the door and looked at the table. The deed lay where he'd left it, but something had changed. The black handprint was fading. In its place, faint but visible, was a new mark, a single circle drawn in charcoal, the same sun symbol he'd seen on the canyon wall. Jack sank into the chair and let the silence settle over him. He wasn't sure if it meant forgiveness or warning. Maybe both. Outside, the storm moved east, and in its wake the land began to breathe again. The next morning came pale and still. The storm had passed, leaving the valley heavy with silence. Jack McCrae walked the ridge, his coat damp and his thoughts darker than the clouds drifting over the distant hills. He couldn't shake the old woman's words. The earth remembers what men forget. They echoed in his mind like hoofbeats down an empty trail. Something pulled him back toward the canyon. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe curiosity, the kind that eats at a man until he has no choice but to look. The ground squelched beneath his boots as he followed the creek, its waters now running red with clay. When he reached the hollow where the woman had been, the fire was gone. Only a ring of stones remained, still faintly warm. But something new had been left behind, a strip of cloth stiff with age folded carefully beneath a rock. He picked it up and shook the dust free. Stitched into the fabric was the same sun symbol, but beneath it were words, English this time, faded yet legible. Fort Huachuca, 1871. Jack's breath caught. That name wasn't new to him. He'd ridden with the army near there once, long before the ranch, long before he tried to become a better man. The cloth slipped from his fingers as the memory returned like fire. He remembered the fort, a cluster of wooden barracks baking under the Arizona sun. He'd been a scout then, younger, reckless, and loyal to the uniform because he didn't know any better. The officers had called it a peace mission. They were to meet a band of Apache who had agreed to return captives and lay down arms. Jack rode ahead, translating the land for men who didn't understand it. When they reached the canyon, the Apache were waiting. Families, not warriors. Women clutching babies, old men sitting by the fire. The chief had stepped forward unarmed, holding a white cloth. Jack remembered the commander, Captain Briggs, smiling, but it wasn't a smile meant for peace. The chief spoke in halting English. "We bring peace." Briggs nodded. "Then we'll keep it." Jack had believed him, until the gunfire started. The first shot came from behind, then another, and the air filled with screams and smoke. Jack shouted, but no one heard. Soldiers fired into the camp. Horses screamed. The white flag fell into the dirt. When it was over, the canyon floor was red, the river running dark with it. He remembered standing there, gun in hand, unable to move. A child's cry had cut through the smoke, thin, high, desperate. He'd run toward it and found a little girl hiding behind a fallen wagon, blood streaking her face. He'd knelt beside her, trembling. "It's all right," he'd said, but it wasn't. She had stared at him with eyes black as obsidian and whispered a word he never forgot, Mija. He never learned what it meant, but the sound of it haunted him ever since. Then Briggs ordered them to burn the camp, and Jack, like a coward, had walked away. Now in the present, Jack knelt in the mud, rain soaking through his jeans, clutching that strip of cloth like the last piece of truth left in the world. The land had brought him here for a reason, maybe to pay what he owed, or maybe to remind him that some debts never fade. They wait. A rustle broke the silence. Jack looked up sharply. At the ridge above him stood the boy again, the same child with the feather stick still as stone. Jack rose slowly. "You followed me," he said. The boy's eyes shifted toward the canyon wall and he pointed, one finger extended, steady as a compass. Jack turned to look. Beneath an overhang lay a stone marker, not natural, carved. He brushed away the moss and found words cut deep into the surface. "Here lies those promised peace." The ground seemed to tilt beneath his boots. He understood now. This was where it had happened. The same canyon, the same blood. The boy's voice came soft but clear. "My mother sleeps here." Jack froze. "Your mother?" The boy nodded, eyes unblinking. Then suddenly it all came together. The girl, the one who had whispered Mija. He whispered it aloud, voice breaking. "Your mother was there." The boy didn't answer. He only turned and began walking toward the ridge, barefoot and sure-footed in the mud. Jack wanted to follow, to explain, to beg forgiveness, but no words came. When he looked again, the boy was gone. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at the deed and the strip of cloth beside it. Two things that told the same truth. The land was never his. He poured himself a drink, but it tasted like dust. His hand trembled as he set the glass down. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters, carrying that same low hum. Voices whispering from far below. Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered into the flickering dark. "I remember now." And somewhere out in the valley, the wind seemed to sigh in return, not angry, not forgiving, but listening. The wind picked up again that night, dry and restless. It moaned through the cracks of the ranch house and made the shutters slam like rifle bolts. Jack McCrae sat at his table, a lamp burning low, the deed and the strip of cloth laid out before him. He hadn't touched his food. The coffee beside his hand had gone cold. He'd spent the day riding the boundary fence, hammering loose posts back into the ground, but everywhere he went he felt the land watching him. The same weight, heavy as confession. Yet something else had crept into the valley now. Something new. When the sun went down he heard it, faint at first, like distant thunder, then clearer, hoofbeats. Jack rose from his chair, hand finding the revolver at his belt. The sound grew louder, closer, until it rolled across the valley in waves. A dozen riders, maybe more. He blew out the lamp and stepped onto the porch. The moon was high, pale and sharp, painting the land in silver. Dust rose at the far end of the property, a moving cloud. Jack crouched behind the rail, eyes narrowing. Figures appeared in the glow, men on horseback, faces hidden by bandanas, torches flickering in their hands. Night riders. They weren't ghosts. They were worse. Men who thought they owned whatever they could scare. Jack slipped back inside, loaded his rifle, and took position near the window. The first torch hit the corral fence, fire catching on the dry wood. Flames leapt up, crackling. He fired once and a warning shot, the sound splitting the night. One of the riders cursed, spinning his horse. Another shouted, "He's awake! Get the deed!" Jack's gut tightened. So that's what this was about. The ranch, the $50 deed sitting on his table. He fired again, hitting a torch from a rider's hand. The flame tumbled into the dirt. They answered with bullets, glass shattering around him. He ducked low, heart pounding, smoke already thick in the air. From outside came the crack of wood and the scream of horses. Then a voice deep and familiar, Bill Tanner. Jack's jaw clenched. Tanner was a rancher from town, a man who'd made a fortune swallowing up smaller spreads. Jack had sold him cattle once. Now the bastard was here, masked like an outlaw. McCrae. Tanner's voice rang through the smoke. You bought what don't belong to you. That ground ain't safe. Not for white men, not for anyone. You give me the deed and I'll let you walk. Jack shouted back, "This land's not yours to claim." There was a pause, then Tanner laughed. "Everything's for sale, McCrae." "You know that." Jack fired again, the bullet sparking off a rock near Tanner's horse. Tanner cursed and waved his arm. "Burn him out!" Torches flew. The dry grass caught, fire racing toward the barn. Jack bolted through the back door, grabbed a bucket, then stopped. It was useless, and the blaze was too fast, too hungry. He ran to untie Jude from the post, the horse thrashing in panic. "Easy, boy," he muttered, cutting the rope. The animal bolted into the dark. Jack turned back toward the fire and froze. On the ridge behind the riders, outlined by firelight, stood the Apache boy. Still silent, watching, and beside him the old woman. Neither moved. The flames painted their faces in golden shadow. The riders didn't see them, Jack did. Then came a sudden whip of wind. The fire shifted, rolling back toward the riders as if the air itself had turned against them. Horses screamed, torches flew from hands. Tanner shouted for retreat. In seconds the men scattered, disappearing into the darkness they came from. Jack stood, chest heaving, smoke burning his eyes. The fire began to die as the wind pushed it into the creek bed, leaving only embers glowing like dying stars. When he looked back toward the ridge, the boy and the woman were gone. He sank to his knees, coughing, staring at the blackened field. The deed in his pocket felt heavier than iron. By dawn the ranch was half ash. The barn was gone. The fences burned. The air still smelled of smoke and rain. Jack walked the perimeter, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon. He found hoofprints leading north, Tanner's men. He could follow them, maybe take one or two down. But another trail caught his eye. Smaller, barefoot, leading up the hill toward the canyon. He followed it until it ended at a shallow rise. There, resting on a flat stone, was a feather bound with red thread, the same kind he'd seen before. And beneath it, carved into the rock, was a single word: listen. Jack knelt, the morning light warm on his face. The land was quiet again, but not empty. The fire hadn't just burned his fences. It had burned away the last of his disbelief. He wasn't alone out here, not anymore. That night, he sat by what was left of the fire pit, staring at the horizon. The stars were cold and far away, and he could almost hear them whisper. He took out the pouch the old woman had given him, untied it and placed a pinch of sage into the flames. The smoke curled upward, sweet and sharp, carrying into the night. Jack whispered, "If you can hear me, I'm listening now." The fire popped once, and somewhere in the dark, far off in the canyon, a low drumbeat echoed, soft, steady, like a heartbeat returning. The valley still smoked from the night before. Ash clung to the sagebrush, and the air carried the scent of burnt wood and memory. Jack McCrae stood at the edge of what had once been his corral, boots blackened, eyes hollow. The fire hadn't only devoured his fences, it had burned through whatever illusion of peace he'd been chasing. He had come to this land for quiet, but all he had found was truth. As the sun broke through the haze, Jack mounted Jude. The horse was restless, nostrils flaring at the stench of scorched earth. Jack patted his neck gently. "We'll find whoever's left, boy. Then we'll decide what kind of men we are." He followed the faint trail of hoofprints leading north, Tanner's men, scattered into the Badlands, nursing burns and curses. But Jack wasn't hunting them, not yet. His eyes were fixed on a smaller trail, a line of barefoot prints winding toward the canyon. By noon he found what he was looking for. The Apache boy lay half-hidden beneath a fallen log near the creek, wrapped in a blanket dark with blood. Jack dropped from his horse, rushed forward, and knelt beside him. The boy's skin was pale with shock, a jagged wound cutting across his shoulder. "Easy now," Jack said, tearing a strip from his shirt to make a bandage. "You're gonna be all right." The boy stirred, eyes fluttering open. "They came," he whispered. Jack nodded grimly. "I saw them. They won't be back tonight." He tied the cloth tight, careful not to hurt him more. The boy's breathing steadied a little, but his gaze stayed distant, as though listening to something beyond the world Jack knew. "Why'd you come back here?" Jack asked quietly. The boy blinked, then said, "My mother told me to." Jack froze. "Your mother's gone, son." The boy shook his head weakly. "She talks in the wind. Says you must see." A chill moved through Jack's spine. "See what?" The boy lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the shadowed mouth of the canyon. Jack hesitated, then lifted the boy carefully into the saddle. "All right," he said. "Show me." They rode slow along the creek bed, the sound of hooves echoing between red cliffs. The air was cool and heavy with that strange hum again. Not quite sound, but presence. Jack couldn't explain it. He could only feel it. The canyon narrowed until the light dimmed to a reddish glow. At its heart stood a flat plateau of stone. The boy motioned for Jack to stop. Jack slid from Jude and carried him into the clearing. "This is where she sleeps," the boy whispered. Jack looked around. At first he saw only rock and sand. Then his eyes adjusted and he saw them. Small mounds of earth covered with stones and sage branches. Dozens of them. Graves. He set the boy down gently and removed his hat. "Your people?" The boy nodded faintly. "The soldiers came. Long ago." Jack's throat tightened. "I know," he said quietly. "I was there." The boy's eyes widened, confusion mixing with sorrow. "You killed them?" Jack's voice broke. "No, but I didn't stop the ones who did." The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying dust like smoke. The boy turned his face away. "Then the ground remembers you too." Jack knelt, hands trembling. "I'm sorry, son, for what I was, for what they did." The boy didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "My mother said the land forgives if you give it back." Jack frowned. "Give what back?" The boy gestured toward the valley. "You took it. You bought it. But it was never yours." Jack thought of the deed in his pocket, the $50 paper that had started everything. He pulled it out, unfolded it, and stared at the fading ink. "You think this matters?" he muttered. "This little piece of paper." "To you it does," the boy said. "To the land it's a wound." Jack looked down at the graves, at the stones, at the dry sage leaves. Then, without another word, he tore the deed in half. The sound cracked through the canyon like a gunshot. He dropped the pieces onto the ground, and the wind lifted them, spinning them into the air before they fell among the graves. The boy smiled faintly. "Now the land knows." They sat together until the light began to fade. Jack rewrapped the boy's wound and shared the last of his water. "You got a name, son?" he asked softly. "Talon," the boy said. Jack managed a small smile. "Strong name." Talon leaned against his arm, exhausted. "You'll hear them tonight," he murmured. "The voices. When the drums begin." "Voices?" Jack asked. They'll tell you what to do." Before he could ask more, the boy had already fallen asleep. Jack stayed beside him as the canyon darkened, listening to the quiet settle like dust. Then, as the last of the sun vanished, he heard it, a distant rhythm, deep and slow, like thunder beneath the earth. Boom, 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 the sound pulsed through the stones, through his bones, through every memory he'd tried to bury. And in that moment, Jack understood. The land wasn't cursed. It was alive. It remembered the blood, but it also remembered the promise that one day someone would make it right. He pulled his coat tighter around the boy and whispered, "I'll make it right, Talon, I swear it." The drums kept beating, steady as a heart learning to live again. The morning broke red as rust, bleeding light across the canyon walls. Jack McCrae awoke to silence, the kind that pressed down, thick and expectant, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Beside him, the boy Talon slept wrapped tight in a torn blanket. His skin was pale, his pulse faint but steady. Jack rose quietly, his back stiff, his hands shaking from cold and memory. Around them, the ashes of the torn deed lay scattered across the graves, grey and still. The earth looked calmer now, as though it had accepted his apology. But forgiveness, Jack knew, never came without cost. He saddled Jude, filled his canteen from the creek, and glanced toward the horizon. A faint column of smoke rose in the distance, too straight to be from brush fire. Riders. Maybe 5. Maybe more. Tanner's men were coming. Jack's jaw tightened. "They never learn," he muttered. He turned to Talon. "Stay here, son. No matter what happens, don't come out till I say." The boy stirred, his voice no louder than the wind. "They'll come for the land." Jack nodded grimly. "And they'll find me first." He rode out into the open valley, sunlight blazing off the blackened earth. What was left of his ranch stood like the skeleton of a dream. Burned beams, scorched boards, and smoke-black stone. A hawk circled above, crying once before vanishing into the glare. Jack stopped in the yard, adjusted the rifle slung across his saddle, and waited. The riders came fast, a storm of dust rising behind them. Tanner rode at the front, hat pulled low, a fresh bandage cutting across his jaw. His men fanned out around him like wolves closing in. "Well, I'll be damned," Tanner called out. "The preacher's still breathing." Jack didn't move. "How you're trespassing?" Tanner laughed, cruel and dry. "Ain't no such thing out here. You bought a patch of dirt that ain't worth the paper it's printed on." Jack's voice stayed calm. "It was never mine to begin with." "But it sure as hell ain't yours either." Tanner spat into the dust, eyes narrowing. "Don't preach to me, McCrae. You think ripping up a deed makes you some kind of saint." "No," Jack said. "It just means I finally stopped lying to myself." For a moment neither man spoke. The wind hissed through the ruins, stirring the ash. Then Tanner's hand twitched toward his gun. Jack was faster. The first shot split the silence clean in half. Tanner's hat flew off, blood streaking his cheek. His men scattered, shouting, guns flashing. Jack spurred Jude behind the water trough and fired back. Bullets tore through the boards, splinters raining down. He fired again. One rider dropped, then another. The third lunged forward and fell before he could pull the trigger. The gunfire rolled across the canyon walls like thunder. Tanner ducked behind the stable, yelling, "You're just one man, McCrae. You can't hold the whole damn valley." Jack's breath came hard and shallow. "Don't need to," he called back. "The land'll do that itself." Then came the sound, low at first, then rising, the same deep rhythm from the night before. Boom, boom, boom. The ground began to tremble beneath them. Horses reared and screamed. Men cursed, trying to steady their mounts. "What the hell?" one of them shouted. The canyon wind roared to life, circling dust and ash into spirals. From the cliffs above, stones began to fall. Small at first, then larger, until the whole ridge shuddered like a waking beast. Tanner looked up, his eyes wide. "What's happening?" Jack didn't answer. He stared toward the canyon mouth, where the drums grew louder. It wasn't a sound made by hands. It was the earth itself remembering. The ground split open near the graves. Water burst forth, cold, clear, and ancient. It surged down the creek bed, a sudden river ripping through the valley. Horses bolted. Men screamed. Tanner scrambled to climb, boots slipping in the rising mud. Jack rode forward, caught him by the collar, and yanked him upright. "You wanted this land?" Jack shouted over the roar. "Now it's yours!" He shoved Tanner back. The current caught him, dragged him under, and carried him toward the canyon's mouth. Jack turned Jude toward higher ground as the flood tore through everything, fences, boards, and memories, washing the valley clean. When the water finally began to settle, only the wind remained. Jack dismounted slowly, his rifle hanging limp at his side. The graves were half submerged, but the stones still stood firm. Sunlight broke through the clouds above them, soft and golden like a benediction. He sank to his knees in the wet earth. "It's done," he whispered. Behind him came a quiet voice. "They're gone?" Jack turned. Talon stood barefoot at the water's edge, wind tugging at his hair. Jack nodded. "All gone." The boy looked out at the flooded valley, then up toward the cliffs. "The land took them back." "Yeah," Jack said softly. "It did." Talon stepped closer. "Now it's clean again." Jack didn't answer. He just stared at the horizon, the valley glimmering with new water, the world reborn from blood and fire. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Not peace, not redemption, something quieter, acceptance. As the sun fell, he and Talon built a small fire near the canyon's edge. The night wind carried no drums now, only the soft hum of the water below. Jack stared into the flames. "What'll you do now, son?" Talon shrugged. "Stay, watch. The land needs someone to listen." Jack smiled faintly. "Then I reckon I'll listen with you." The boy nodded. The wind moved again, not angry this time, but gentle, like breath on skin. It swept through the grass, over the stones, across the graves, whispering in a language neither of them knew, but both could feel. Jack tipped his hat low. "Guess we ain't alone after all." The fire cracked once, bright and steady against the dark. The floodwaters lingered for 3 days before the sun slowly drew them back into the thirsty soil. What had once been dry and lifeless began to stir again, a thin sheen of green pushing through cracks in the valley floor as the scent of wet earth filled the air. Jack McCrae stood by the canyon rim, hat in hand, watching as a new river carved its way across the basin. It shimmered under the morning light, like a vein of silver through the heart of the desert. Beside him sat Talon, legs crossed, tracing circles in the damp sand. His bandaged shoulder had begun to heal, though his eyes still carried the weight of all he'd seen. "Does it stay?" the boy asked softly. Jack squinted at the horizon. "Water's like truth, son. It don't stay unless you respect it." The boy nodded, thoughtful. "Then we'll take care of it." Jack smiled faintly. "That we will." In the days that followed, they walked the valley together, through what was left of the old ranch, past the places where Tanner's men had fallen, and among the graves that still stood untouched by the flood. Jack rebuilt the fences not to claim ownership, but to guide the flow of water, turning it toward the old creek beds. Talon followed him everywhere, quiet and observant. Sometimes he would stop suddenly, head tilted, listening to something only he could hear. When Jack asked what it was, the boy would simply say, "They're talking." "Who?" Jack would ask. "The ones under the ground." "The ones you freed." Jack never questioned it again. On the 5th morning, a rider appeared on the horizon, a government man from Tucson, wearing a badge and carrying papers. He reined in near the half-broken gate and called out, "McCrae, you're still alive." Jack wiped the sweat from his brow. "Mostly." The man dismounted, frowning at the valley. "Heard there was trouble. Said you bought this place for $50. "Used to own it," Jack said. "Don't anymore," the man blinked. "Don't see anyone else here." Jack glanced toward Talon, who stood ankle-deep in the new stream, letting the water run through his hands. "You're looking at the new owner," he said. The man laughed. "Ain't how it works, McCrae. Land needs a signature." Jack pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Not the deed, but a letter he'd written days before. "Then take this back to Tucson," he said. "Tell them the land's under protection now. Apache ground, sacred." The man frowned. "You sure about this?" "That's near 10 acres of good land. You could build again. Live easy," Jack smiled tiredly. "I've done enough living easy. Time I start living right." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll file it the way you want." He tipped his hat toward Talon. "You take care of him, boy." Talon didn't answer, just watched the man ride away until he disappeared beyond the ridge. Then he turned to Jack. "You gave it back." Jack nodded. "Didn't belong to me." The boy's eyes softened. "Now it belongs to the river." Jack looked out across the valley where the sunlight danced on the rippling water. "Yeah," he said, "and maybe to us too, if we listen close enough." As the weeks passed, travelers began to share stories. They spoke of a man who lived by the canyon, a former gunslinger who built no fences and charged no tolls, and a boy who spoke to the wind in a valley where the river sang at night. They said the man had bought the land cheap, but paid for it with something far greater. When Jack heard those stories, he'd just shake his head and smile. "Let 'em talk," he'd say. "Truth don't need defending," Talon would grin. "They call you the Waterkeeper," Jack laughed. "I've been called worse." One night as they sat by the fire, Talon looked up at the stars and asked, "Do you think the land forgets?" Jack poked at the embers. "No, but maybe it forgives, same as people do if you give it time." The boy leaned against him. "Then we'll keep it safe so it don't forget the right things." Jack put an arm around his shoulders. "That's the deal, partner." The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night. The air smelled of rain and pine, and for the first time in years, Jack felt no ghosts in the wind, as only peace. Years passed the way seasons do when a man stops counting them. The valley changed, though not in the way towns did. There were no fences now, no saloons, no church bells, only open earth and running water, a thin blue ribbon weaving through grass and mesquite. Travelers who passed through called it McCrae's Valley, though Jack never liked the name. To him it was still Apache ground, living, breathing, and sacred. He'd grown older, his face carved deep with sun and memory. His beard had gone silver, and his hands, though slower, still carried the same quiet strength. Most mornings he spent by the water's edge, mending the small wooden sluices he and Talon had built to guide the stream. Talon had grown too, taller now, his eyes wise beyond his years, his hair long and sun-browned. He carried the calm of someone who understood both worlds, the white man's and the one the wind still remembered. Some evenings, they sat together by the fire, silent, watching the river shimmer beneath the moon. Neither spoke much. The land said enough. One evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, a wagon appeared on the horizon, creaking wheels, a tired mule, and a woman clutching a small child. She looked worn, hungry, her eyes wide from the long trail. Jack spotted her before she saw him. Stepping out from the cabin, he tipped his hat. "Evening, ma'am," she startled, then smiled nervously. "Sorry to intrude. We lost the road somewhere near Dry Creek. Been right in 2 days with no water." Jack nodded toward the river. "You found it." He helped her down, fetched a pail, and let the mule drink. The little girl, no more than 6, stared at the water like it was magic. "It just started flowing one day," Jack said. "Never stopped since." The woman smiled weakly. "Looks like a miracle." Jack glanced at Talon, who stood nearby, quiet and watchful. "Some folks say that. They shared food that night, beans and hard bread, nothing fancy." The woman spoke about moving west, her husband dying in a mining camp and her search for a new start. Jack listened without judgment, the faint smile of a man who'd walked the same hard road. When the stars came out, the little girl pointed upward. "Mama says stars are holes where heaven leaks through," she said. Jack chuckled softly. "Sounds like your mama's right." The woman studied him for a long moment. "You live out here alone?" Jack looked toward Talon, then at the river. "Not alone. Not anymore." The next morning, the woman packed her wagon. Before leaving, she pressed something into Jack's hand, an old silver coin worn smooth. "For the water," she said. "For saving us." Jack shook his head. "Don't need paying. Please," she whispered. "You gave us more than money ever could." He studied the coin and smiled faintly. 50 cents, huh?" She nodded, puzzled. He slipped it into his pocket. "Guess that's what peace costs now." She climbed onto the wagon, nodded her thanks, and rode toward the horizon. The wind followed her trail until the dust swallowed her whole. When silence returned, Talon stood beside him. "You let her go," Jack nodded. "She's got her own path." The boy frowned. "What'll you do when the river stops?" Jack smiled faintly. "Then I'll know my time's up." Talon hesitated. "You think the land will forget you?" Jack looked across the valley, the golden grass waving, the water winding like a living vein through the dust. "No," he said quietly, "but I hope it remembers you." Talon said nothing. He just stood there, the wind tugging at his hair, the reflection of the river dancing in his eyes. That night the drums returned, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Jack woke to the sound and stepped outside. The stars burned sharp above him, and the water shimmered silver. He felt no fear, only stillness. Walking to the river's edge, he knelt. "It's been a long trail," he whispered, "but I reckon I've found my way home." The wind stirred and warm, gentle, and for a heartbeat he thought he heard a woman's voice in it, soft and clear. "You did well, Jack." He smiled. "Took me long enough." Then the wind settled. The stars kept shining, and the valley breathed easy. By dawn the river was still running, was quiet, steady, endless. Talon found him sitting by the water, hat in his lap, eyes closed, face turned toward the light. He didn't wake when the boy called his name. The land was silent for a long moment. Then the wind rose, wrapping around Talon like a promise. He knelt beside Jack and whispered, "Rest now, old one. The land remembers." He placed Jack's hat over his heart and turned to the river. The water shimmered brighter, as if welcoming another spirit home. Years later, travelers who crossed that valley spoke of a man they never met, a cowboy who bought a ranch for $50, only to give it back to the earth. They said that when the wind blew just right, you could still hear hoofbeats near the water, and the soft whisper of a man's voice saying, "The land forgives," and down by the river's edge, a young Apache man watched over it all, silent, patient, guarding the ground where the water met the dust. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more unforgettable tales from me. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss a new episode. Thanks for watching.